Welcome to Assessment Joining the Dots. We are GL Assessment or GL Education, depending on where you are in the world. We're the leading provider of formative standardised assessments in the UK and Ireland and work with schools in over 100 countries worldwide. We're doing this podcast because we're passionate about supporting teaching and learning the best ways we know how, with robust, reliable assessments and assessment data, but also really importantly, the tools and means for you all to make the best use of this. Now, this is all because we genuinely care about children's futures and moving education forwards, playing our part so that we allow teachers to do what they're best at, which is to teach. You'll find some reoccurring segments like our data spotlights, where we take some of the more commonly used terminology in standardised assessments and explain these in a totally transparent, accessible way for everyone. We're growing more and more aware of the lack of really good quality assessment training for educators across the world, so we're really hoping to support as many of you as possible to plug that gap. Whether you're using our assessments or not, we hope that this podcast is for you if you're in education and feel like you could do with knowing a bit more about assessment. We're going to discuss topics that matter to you, and the focus for today is transition, using data effectively through transition, with the wonderful Vicky Merrick, who you will hear from later in the episode. I'm Helen Robinson, Head of Customer Experience at GL Assessment. I lead a team of former teachers dedicated to helping you make the best use of your assessment data to inform next steps in school, wherever you are. I'm a former teacher myself, having worked as a secondary science teacher and second in department in a school in Derby. Prior to that, I completed a PhD in cognitive neuroscience and neuroimaging. So where I am now really brings together my two backgrounds of sort of strong data handling, analysis and interpretation, and also my experience in education, the realities of teaching.
Welcome to Vicky Merrick, our first ever GL podcast guest. Thank you for joining us to help join the dots, Vicky.
No problem. Good to meet you, Helen, again.
Just to introduce you for our listeners, you are currently an education consultant, an ASCL consultant, and you spent almost 20 years looking at trust and school level data strategy and impact. Anything you want to add?
Well, yeah, that is how it started. But naturally, when you're working in schools, you end up looking at anything and everything that's required. So as well as those things, careers, strategic careers improvement, supporting SEND and literacy strategy colleagues. So yeah, it's one of those things, as most school leaders will know, that once you're in there and you gain knowledge, you just keep learning and then keep supporting people along the way.
Lovely. And I know that you're really passionate about leading positive change and positively leading change, which is so needed right now in the teaching profession. So I know that that's something that you sort of bundle up all of your experience across all of those areas and do things really positively with that positive mindset, I know. Lovely. So we're talking all things transition today. We'll touch a little bit on our Key Stage 3 assessment package, but mainly focusing on transition and how educators can make the best use of data at transition. So I wanted to start by asking you, what for you are the most important things to understand or know about learners at transition?
So transition was an area that I really got into for a while, because when you think about it, there's a lot of people and professionals all trying to work together at the point of transition. You have all of the professionals at the primary school, you have the parents, carers, and any other agency workers, and then you have all of the teachers, tutors, year leaders, heads, principals, Senkos, you can imagine, at secondary school. That is the point where I've come to learn that the most number of professionals are in collaboration. So with that, when I started really looking into this in one of my previous positions, what I came to learn was that there needed to be something to pull all of those people together, because every single one of them holds some really fascinating information. And when I say information, some of them hold data, as in numerical, quantitative data, but some of them hold some really interesting and fascinating qualitative data, or something I'd refer to more as the human data. So it's that knowledge of the children, knowledge of how they respond in certain environments, that knowledge of how they've learnt, the speed of their learning, the best situations for their learning, anything that's interrupted their learning or is presenting as a barrier. So to answer your question, what's the most important things at transition to know about the learners? It's, frankly, how do you pull all of those things together? And how do you make sure you've not missed anything? So for me, it was always like straight away getting to the bottom of reading, not just what the SAT scores say, but also the reading at the point of arrival in September. So because reading opens doors to all of the learning. So that was a really important start. I was really interested in cross-referencing, reading with what we know about students who either have been attributed a SEND code, or maybe are going through stages of assessments or referral or even just on monitoring, because it was fascinating to start to give more information about where that barrier to learning and success might lie for that child. A few weeks in, once we'd gone through our transition settling, we used to pick up on the PASS survey to understand, at 4 or 5 weeks into secondary school, what are people's attitudes at that point, attitudes to self and school. That gave us a really interesting matching activity to how their year 6 teachers had described their attitudes to school. So you imagine, how were they when they left year 6 in July versus how are they now 5-6 weeks into secondary school? And is there any correlation, any change, any emerging concerns, those sorts of things, so we could get involved quickly. So reading was something I was really fascinated with. Yeah, anything that supports our SEND colleagues, because that's a huge undertaking at the start of a year 7 when we're trying to get to know students as quickly as possible. And then attitudes to self and school, because everything else comes from there. And I know there's lots of other ways that you could utilise data, but if I was to pick top 3, that's where I'd go.
So, taking a short break from our interview with Vicky, we're now moving into our first data spotlight explainer, one of several in a series that we will be running in each episode. So you'll hear 1 or 2 each time. And these are designed to help you understand the data terminology in as easy way as possible. I'll now hand over to Sadie and James to explain standardised tests.
So we've just heard Vicky and Helen discussing the role that standardised assessment can play at the point of arrival in September. What better way to kick off our Data Spotlight series than our first focus on standardised tests? So I think a great place to start would be to hand over to James. James, can you give us a quick summary as to what a standardised test is?
Of course, a standardised test requires all learners to answer the same questions under the same conditions. This then provides a consistent score to compare their performance in relation to others nationally. And standardised tests consider the exact age of learners, which makes the comparison of their performance much fairer.
And clearly that's one of the huge benefits of standardised tests, that accurate comparison to other learners. I just wanted to build on something that Vicky mentioned earlier. It was that standardised tests should form part of an effective assessment system, but they clearly cannot measure everything. And so for this reason, standardised tests are best used alongside all of that regular in-class formative feedback about what a learner knows or can do.
Absolutely. It's about putting that data into context. I wanted to touch on a couple of great questions that we often receive from schools about standardised tests as well. One of which is, are standardised tests like a SAT or GCSE exam, for example?
That is actually a fantastic question. And although they are fairly similar in the way that they are administered, they are also very different. So a GCSE or SAT exam would be taken under the same conditions. However, the questions for GCSE and SAT exams will change year on year, as well as the grade boundaries. Standardisation of an assessment actually takes a really long time, and you need a strong back catalogue of data to do that. Because SATs and GCSE's data is analysed post-test and changes every year, it would be impossible to standardise tests like these. So I guess this question actually links really nicely to another great question we get asked, which is, does the sample of learners that you're comparing with change every year?
Well, because it's based on the original sample, so that we can make those consistent comparisons year on year, the short answer to that is no. Standardization of data takes a long time, and as mentioned, it's not an annual process. Standardized tests are designed to remain stable over a much longer period of time, and the standardization process itself usually takes a year or more to complete. If the assessments were restandardized annually, then the tests themselves would not be as robust or reliable, because a score of 100, or any other score for that matter, would mean different things from one year to the next, a little like grade boundaries at GCSE. We do, however, validate the scores annually. In other words, the scores we see every year are checked against the original dataset to ensure that the standardization still holds true.
And now back to our interview with Vicky Merrick. What role do you think standardised assessment data plays at transition? Obviously, there are lots of different types of data. You've mentioned a few already, but particularly standardised assessment data. What role does that play, do you think, at transition, or what role could that play at transition?
What's really great about sort of standardised age scores as opposed to the scaled scores at Key Stage 2 is that you learn how students are progressing in line with others of the same age. Well, I think you do it in months. So you come to understand them as individuals at their point. It gives you a baseline, a comparator compared to other individuals that have experienced exactly the same amount of schooling as them. Well, COVID allowed and other barriers and things. And I think that's something that we should all understand a little bit more, because actually I brought this up with somebody recently who was writing a paper on things in education that are sort of mismatched. And one of the things I identified and sent along to him to, add into his thinking was the fact that at primary school, early stages of learning, the difference in age between a September-born baby and a July-born baby in the same year group is significant, and therefore the difference in their progress, the rate of progress, all of those things is really significant, and we really care about that at primary, and there's real benefit in understanding that. And so when you're doing standardized assessments, you're looking at how your students are doing, not just compared to each other in your small bubble of brilliance at your school or your environment, but you're also looking to see how does that stack up compared to a national sample. Even the way comparison puts people on edge, the hairs go up. Who are you comparing me to? Because that's a fallout of our high stakes accountability system. But when you're thinking about comparison, you're thinking about, reframe it as this question: are we doing everything we can and doing right by that child compared to others of the same age? Or is there anything else we could be doing to support that child to accelerate their progress, their learning, whatever it is you're looking at, compared to others of that age? So that's where benchmarking becomes really powerful, because you take the ego out of it, you take the fear of accountability out of it, and you look in at the child. You're then questioning, are we doing our very best? And I can honestly say I've never met somebody in school, in any school I work with, that doesn't deliberately come into school every day to do their best. That's what we're all trying to do. So there's the standardized age scores, they have a place because they help us to answer that question. They help us to look for ways to do a better job.
I really like what you said, particularly about how can we accelerate their learning, no matter where their starting point is, not necessarily looking for holes in things, not necessarily looking for gaps, but actually sort of flipping it on its head and saying, how can we accelerate their learning, whoever they are, wherever they are? How can we do that? What steps can we take to do that? And the data signposting you to the right places. We have a Key Stage 3 assessment package that's very popular at transition because it covers sort of many of the areas that you mentioned earlier. NGRT for reading, PASS, pupil attitudes, self and school, so actually understanding how pupils feel about themselves as learners in their school environment. our spelling test, new group spelling test, which goes along with the new group reading test, NGRT, progress test series in English, maths and science, and our cognitive abilities test, CAP4, which assesses the main types of reasoning known to make a difference to learning and achievement. So the final question I had for you, I know that you've used a number of those assessments before. What are your top tips for how schools can make the best use of this very powerful data at transition?
Yeah, it's a good one because there's a lot of really useful assessments there, isn't there? And if you fall into the trap of just administering them all the minute a child walks in, you're not really going to even ask their name because they'll be too busy doing assessments. So my first top tip is to think really carefully about how and when, if you want that information, how and when it's the most appropriate time to do it. Not just appropriate for you as an organisation, finding out more information about children, but also appropriate for them. Because, young people are really vulnerable to some extent at the point that they transition to a new school, and their first impressions are going to be really important. And I'm sure there isn't one school out there that hasn't got a vision statement that talks about nurture and wanting to understand their pupils and do the best by them. So my first top tip would be, obviously they're all useful assessments, but just schedule them really, really carefully. Think about that sort of cost-benefit analysis. What am I going to learn from this? What do I need to know? Versus what's the cost to the child's experience of transition? And just get the balance right. There's no perfect way of doing it, but get the balance right so that they are being seen as pupils as well as assessment information.
I'm so glad you said that, because timing is something that we're often asked about, and particularly working for an assessment company, some people have the misconception that I must believe that testing, lots of testing, is what we should be doing with children, and actually it's not true at all. What I really care about is that we're not over testing children. I think it's the saddest thing in the world, the most heartbreaking thing in the world, to think of kids doing assessment after assessment, particularly again if I refer back to what I said about having too much data. If that data isn't used for anything, that really breaks my heart that those kids have sat an assessment with to no gain or benefit. So yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree, and my top tip is certainly not over testing. I think one thing that I can be really passionate about working at GL is that we do have really robust standardized assessments. So actually it's about using less more strategically to free up teacher time. So yeah, scheduling, prioritizing, obviously you've got to prioritize to be able to schedule effectively, but asking that question, what do I need to know, what will I learn, to help you schedule that well and think about the students as you go. Definitely.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I'll let you carry on.
I love that. You're absolutely right. And I'm sorry that people think you're a testing. You're obsessed with assessment. It's really sad. Knowing you as I do, I know that's not the case. What would my next top tip be? So my next top tip would be, you want reliable data. You want it to have, a point of validity comes from the testing that you're doing already. So GL have dealt with that. But I would say you want reliability. So what you can do as a school, as an organisation, is think really carefully about the environment that the students are in when they sit these assessments. So after a bit of feedback in our environment from students and parents, we came to understand that they weren't entirely sure about why they were sitting these assessments. So we did a huge piece of work on talking to them about it and how it's going to help us understand who they are and how they need to, not worry about them by any stretch of the imagination, definitely no revision required, but how they just need to put their all into it and just be really honest and authentic in their testing. So we did a lot of work on preparing students in terms of what to expect. So you haven't got that unintended consequence of, assessment anxiety or any of that coming through. And then we also did a lot of work with preparing whomever it was going to be, whether it's a teacher or another member of staff, who was facilitating that assessment. Who is it who stood at the front of that computer room or suite of laptops or iPads or wherever you are, you're saying, okay, you know, this is how you log on, this is how you move forward. Those people also needed to understand what was happening. They needed support in being able to get the students to that right frame of mind, to not be frightened of this, but to really embrace it.
Thank you so much, Vicky, and no doubt we shall speak soon.
Thanks, Helen.
You heard Vicky and I talk about Cat 4 in our interview. So now we're going to move into our second data spotlight of today, which is Cat 4. Handing back to Sadie and James.
Hello. As we've just been hearing from Helen and Vicky about Cat 4, we're here to give you some more context about the assessment itself. So Sadie, what exactly is Cat 4?
So the Cognitive Abilities Test, or CAT4, reveals hidden potential by assessing the main types of reasoning known to make a difference to learning and achievement, essentially providing school staff with a rounded profile of the whole child. For example, a child's verbal skills in the classroom might be kind of fairly obvious, but potentially that's only part of the story, and that's where CAT4 can help, as it gives school staff the insight into the other areas of ability, such as the non-verbal, spatial and quantitative reasoning abilities.
That's great. And how exactly would a teacher find these insights, and how often would they need to do so?
A great two-pronged question there, James. So to gain those insights, the first step would be, after testing, downloading those reports and looking at the learner's standard age score, or SAS, for each area of reasoning to help identify strengths and challenges that may impact a learner's access to that wider curriculum. So, for example, a learner with a lower SAS score across all areas of reasoning might require more general support, whereas a learner with a particular bias might need a specific targeted intervention. Another layer of insight might be using the indicators available in some of the CAT4 reports that can be used to indicate future performance, and can really help guide conversations about qualification and career choices with learners and potentially their families as well. Now, moving on to the second part of the question, how often learners should sit CAT4 assessment, is certainly a great question and one that we're asked a lot. So if we think about the CAT4, unlike attainment, which is assessed more regularly to show progress over time, a learner's ability is actually fairly stable. For this reason, the CAT4 does not need to be used year on year, as it's not designed to show progress in the same way as an attainment test. There are certainly key points where it's more common for schools to use the CAT4 more regularly. So, for example, at key transition points, like at the start of Year 7. And some schools also choose to use the CAT4 again in Year 9 to help support GCSE choices. That timely approach there also gives schools a really great opportunity to check in on how key demographic groups, such as EAL learners, have been progressing over Key Stage 3, as those learners are likely to have made quite large gains in their verbal reasoning scores over that time.
Can I just pick up on something that you mentioned earlier? You said that insights from Cat4 can help learners across the wider curriculum. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So when we think about traditional assessments, and certainly the curriculum itself often focuses on verbal skills, but might not necessarily show learners that excel in other ways. If we think about those other ability areas, the non-verbal and spatial and the quantitative, they're really important in a wide range of STEM subjects, such as your sciences, technologies, engineering and maths. So if we had the hat on of a science teacher with a new incoming Year 7 class, that teacher would be able to use their CAT4 data quickly to work out which learners potentially have lower than average verbal reasoning skills. Those learners may struggle to articulate key concepts in science, but their profile may also suggest that they have higher than average spatial abilities and therefore could be rather proficient at running things like practical assessments.
Fantastic. I can see how useful that would be for teachers who want to get to know their learners quickly and adapt their teaching as needed. We often hear similar stories from schools that we work with, actually. One school told us about a learner who we'll call Amy. Amy was a strong, confident learner, but she started to become disengaged, which was unlike her, and her teachers were surprised until they looked at her CAT4 scores, and they revealed that she had higher verbal skills compared to her spatial abilities. So her strengths were actually masking her weaknesses, and without CAT4 data, this could have gone unnoticed for months. Her teachers were then able to get ideas from the CAT4 reports for how to develop Amy's spatial skills, such as using maps, diagrams, and graphs, as well as continuing with activities to boost her strengths in verbal reasoning.
Now to our light bulb moment. This is where we would love to hear from all of you, and we'll be playing these each episode. What's the story of your light bulb moment, the moment you realised the power of your GL assessment data? What difference did it make to you or your learners? What did you learn? What problem did it help you to solve?
Hello, my name's Samantha Krbacevic and I work at Repton Prep. And my light bulb moment came with assessments, I think this year when we were doing the PASS testing alongside some of our other Cat 4 testing and progress testing. And we noticed that one pupil in particular that always does really well in the classroom, really high ability and was always really sparky. Their standardised scores on the Cat 4 and the PT and PTM never quite matched up with what we thought they should be based on the teacher experience. And when we ran the PASS test and triangulated that data, we saw that there was an issue with self-confidence and self-perception of ability. And that allowed us to actually have really frank conversations with that pupil that showed that they actually had quite a lot of anxiety around testing and the perception of higher stakes testing than sort of everyday classroom. And through that, we were able to talk to that pupil, help them understand what it was we were trying to achieve with the testing cycle and actually lessen that anxiety a lot. And, we are hopefully going to be showing some really good progress data now for that pupil and some impact through that. But that certainly was a light bulb moment for me, because without the past data, we wouldn't have been able to spot that there had been any issue with this pupil, and we would have just taken that data on face value.
So to get involved, and we really do want to hear from you, so please do, the best way to get in touch is to send us a WhatsApp voice note with your contribution to 07917 516 515. Thanks for joining us today for our first ever assessment Joining the Dots podcast. Please head to our training and support site support.gl-assessment.co.uk or support.gl-education.com, depending on where you are in the world. Tweet us at @GL_assessment or @GL_education and email us if you'd like to know more or contribute. We'd love to hear from you, as I've said. The email address is podcast@gl-assessment.co.uk. Please do follow our podcast on whichever platform you're listening to us on. Subscribe to be notified when new episodes are available. Rate our podcast and share. Please do share with your friends and colleagues on social media. Join us next time for a reading theme episode, speaking to Beth Morrish from Meridian Trust to hear about NGRT and reading ages. Thanks again for joining us today.